I want to tell you about a moment this week that I think a lot of people are going to scroll right past. And I think that would be a mistake, because buried inside a routine end of mini-camp press conference, Klint Kubiak said something about Fernando Mendoza that wasn't really about what he said at all. It was about what he refused to say. And if you've been counting down the days until this kid takes over that offense, I need you to brace yourself a little, because what I'm about to walk you through is not the version of this story you were hoping for. It's the more honest one. Let's set the table first, because context matters enormously here. The Raiders quarterback room right now is a genuine three-man fight. Kirk Cousins, Fernando Mendoza, and Aiden O'Connell are all competing for real positioning, real reps, real influence over how this season opens. On paper, that's exactly the kind of internal pressure you want building a roster. Competition sharpens everybody involved, but there's an emotional current running underneath this specific competition that I don't think gets talked about honestly enough. Mendoza isn't just another name in that room. He's the first-round investment this fan base has been holding its breath for. He's the reason a chunk of last season felt like it was being played with one eye permanently fixed on draft positioning instead of the scoreboard in front of everyone. So when a head coach starts choosing words about that specific player, every syllable lands differently than it would for anyone else in that building. Intentional or not, the weight is there. So here's exactly what happened. A reporter asked Kubiak directly about Mendoza, framed it almost gently, something along the lines of, "It looks like he's settling in more comfortably under center. What's your read on that?" And Kubiak's answer, on its surface, sounded like praise. He talked about effort, about how hard the kid is working, about visible improvement over these past months. That's a perfectly fine answer if you're not listening closely. But I want you to actually sit in the silence of what didn't get said, because that absence is doing more talking than the words themselves. Kubiak did not say Mendoza is reading defenses at a high level right now. He didn't say his ball placement has sharpened to where it needs to be. He didn't say defensive coordinators are struggling to disguise their looks well enough to fool him anymore. None of that came up, not once. What came up repeatedly was work ethic, in the abstract, disconnected from any specific on-field marker of readiness. And look, work ethic is the foundation everything else gets built on top of. I'm not dismissing it, but when a head coach is handed multiple direct opportunities to speak to actual production from a young quarterback and keeps steering the conversation back toward effort and general improvement, that's not an accident. That's a coach choosing his language with real precision. And precision from a coach standing in that exact spot is rarely something that just happens by chance. It got even more revealing from there, and this is the part that really stuck with me. A follow-up question referenced something Mendoza himself had said publicly, that he feels leaps and bounds ahead of where he was when he first walked into that building. The reporter essentially asked Kubiak point blank whether he agreed with his own quarterback's self-assessment, and Kubiak didn't answer it, not directly. He circled back to the same language about being happy with the work ethic, and then pivoted into something that, listening back, sounded less like praise and more like a quiet warning aimed at the entire room. He talked about how everybody in this league has to keep improving every single day, because the moment you stop climbing, somebody else takes the ground out from under you. Sit with that phrasing for a second. That is not the language of a coach celebrating a young quarterback's ascension. That's the language of a coach reminding an entire room, Mendoza very much included, that nothing in that building is owed to anyone. And when the room in question includes a healthy, motivated Kirk Cousins and a quietly dangerous Aiden O'Connell, that warning isn't theoretical. It's a live, breathing competitive threat sitting right there in the same meeting room. Now, I want to be fair to the whole picture here, because Kubiak didn't leave Mendoza twisting in isolation without giving us anything else to compare it against. He gave real, specific context on where the other two quarterbacks in that room actually stand, and that context completely reshapes how you should be reading this entire situation. When he talked about Cousins, the language shifted into something noticeably more positive. Healthier than he's looked in recent seasons, rejuvenated, genuinely playing good football throughout this stretch of the offseason program. And if that's actually accurate, if Cousins really is healthy and performing at a high level again, that changes the entire calculus for how urgently this coaching staff needs to fast-track Mendoza into live competitive action. You don't have to rush your rookie when your veteran starter is healthy and producing. That's a luxury most rebuilding franchises don't get handed. It's one the Raiders currently have sitting in their lap. They don't need Mendoza game ready by week 1. What they need is for his development curve to keep climbing, because the instant it flattens out, this coaching staff is going to notice immediately, and they will not hesitate to lean fully on the guy who's already winning right now. And then there's Aidan O'Connell, who I genuinely think deserves more respect in this entire conversation than a large portion of this fan base has been giving him. Kubiak didn't have to bring his name up unprompted the way he did, and the specific framing he used stood out to me immediately. He referenced having actually competed against O'Connell in a live game environment himself, and said he wasn't even remotely surprised by the strong camp O'Connell has been putting together. Then he dropped a detail that I think gets lost in the shuffle. O'Connell has now played under 6 different offensive coordinators before even reaching his 4th professional season. Think about that level of instability for a second. 6 different systems, 6 different terminologies, 6 different ways of seeing the game, before most quarterbacks have even settled into one real offensive identity. That's the kind of chaos that gives a young player every excuse in the world to plateau or regress. And instead of framing that history as an excuse for O'Connell, Kubiak framed it as fuel, as proof that this is a player who's used instability to keep sharpening himself rather than letting it soften him. When a head coach singles out a backup quarterback unprompted and frames him in language like that, it tells you he's not just keeping a seat warm in case of emergency. That's a coach signaling, deliberately, that O'Connell is a real and live part of this conversation. So here's where I actually land on all of this, and I want to give it to you straight rather than feeding you the easier, more exciting version. Conventional wisdom says Cousins opens the season as the starter, and based on everything Kubiak has said and how he said it, I think that remains the most likely path by a real, meaningful margin. I wouldn't be shocked at all if Aidan O'Connell ends up seeing real, consequential snaps earlier in the season than people currently expect, especially if there's any dip in Cousins' health or performance level. As for Mendoza, and I say this as someone who genuinely wants this kid to succeed as much as anyone watching this franchise, I think we need to mentally prepare ourselves for the real possibility that we might not see him on that field in any consequential way for a long stretch of this season. Maybe some mop-up snaps once games are already decided deep into November or December. Maybe not even that much. Because Kubiak has been remarkably, almost stubbornly consistent on this exact point all offseason, and consistency from a coach, especially under direct questioning, is usually the most honest signal you're going to get from him. He is not going to rush this young man ahead of what the tape actually says he's ready for, no matter how loudly the fan base wants to see him out there under the lights. Now, stepping outside the quarterback room for a second, because Kubiak talked at length about the broader culture being built inside that organization, and honestly, this is the part of his comments that I keep replaying in my head, because I think it tells you more about where this franchise is genuinely headed than any single depth chart projection ever could. He mentioned that for most of this offseason program, players didn't wear the shield on their helmets. They had to earn that right, and heading into minicamp, they finally did. I love that detail, and I genuinely don't think it's a gimmick or a marketing line. I think it's a deliberate, intentional statement aimed at every single player walking through that building. That putting on this uniform isn't some passive thing that happens automatically because your name appears on a roster sheet. It's something you actively earn every single day through how you carry yourself and how hard you actually work when nobody's forcing you to. And Kubiak backed that philosophy up with something even more concrete. He said accountability inside that building is completely non-negotiable. If something gets done wrong, you do it again, immediately. No shortcuts, no walking past a mistake and quietly pretending it didn't happen. Because on Sunday, every single person's job is genuinely on the line in a way that doesn't forgive sloppiness. Kirk Cousins reportedly put it even more bluntly in his own words, "This isn't a country club." And Kubiak confirmed that's exactly the standard he's holding every single person to. No exceptions. You show up, you work, you improve, or somebody else who's hungrier takes your spot. That is the actual foundation underneath winning football programs. And coming from a coach with Kubiak's specific lineage and track record, that message carries genuine weight instead of sounding like a recycled coaching cliche you've heard 1,000 times before. He also said something that I think every single fan watching this team needs to internalize before training camp opens, because it's incredibly easy to get lulled into false confidence by what you see during shorts and helmet sessions. He said you can get comfortable watching certain guys look smooth and effortless in non-contact reps, and then watch some of those exact same players completely disappear the moment real pads go on and actual contact enters the picture. And on the flip side of that same coin, there are players nobody is talking about right now who are going to step up and prove their real value the instant the games start mattering and the hits start actually counting. That's a critical reality check heading into this next phase. Minicamp tells you something real, but it does not tell you everything. Training camp is where the actual roster gets revealed in full, where the pretenders get exposed under real pressure and the genuine competitors get permanently confirmed. So, with mandatory minicamp now fully behind us and this team heading into its stretch of summer separation, I want to walk through exactly how I think this 53-man roster picture is shaping up right now based on everything we've actually seen on the field. At quarterback, it's locked in. Cousins, Mendoza, and O'Connell, all three make this roster. No surprises sitting there. At running back, Ashton Jeanty is an obvious lock at this point, and Mike Washington Jr. earns his spot right alongside him. Connor Hayward has genuinely impressed at fullback. And here's where things get interesting. Dylan Lobb currently appears to be winning the job over Roman Hemby, and I'll be honest, that's a genuinely tough call because Hemby looks like a legitimately solid football player in his own right. But Lobb has been one of the clearest standout performers across this entire minicamp, proving he can contribute meaningfully in the passing game, in the run game, and on special teams simultaneously. That kind of three-way positional versatility is exactly the trait that earns you a roster spot inside a genuinely competitive backfield. At wide receiver, Trey Tucker, Jalen Naylor, and Jack Beck look like your locked-in top three right now. Malik Benson also secures himself a real spot, and the battle for that final receiver slot comes down to Shedrick Jackson against Dante Thornton. Jackson has had a standout camp by almost any measure, genuinely one of the better individual performances across this entire roster, period. Thornton remains well-liked inside that locker room, and there's real organizational hope still invested in his long-term development. But if he isn't contributing meaningfully on special teams, it becomes very difficult to justify keeping him over a player like Jackson, who's been earning his spot on the field every single day without exception. At tight end, no surprises whatsoever. Brock Bowers, Michael Mayer, and Ian Thomas round out that room exactly as everyone expected heading into this offseason. On the offensive line, 9 players make the final cut, and given the positional versatility this specific group has displayed combined with Rick Dennison's proven track record developing offensive line rooms, this unit carries real upside heading into the regular season. On the defensive interior, the tackle room is currently shaping up around J.J. Pegas, Adam Butler, Jonah Laulu, and 7th-round pick Braden Cleveland. At defensive end, Max Crosby anchors that entire group alongside Tyree Wilson, Charles Snowden, Malcolm Kuntz, and the rest of that rotation. At linebacker, Key Walker and Nicholas Morrow have clearly emerged as the top 2 names, with Cody Barton and Tommy Eichenberg pushing hard for real meaningful roles after standing out specifically while filling in during Nico Dean's absence from these sessions. In the secondary, Eric Stokes profiles as the clear #1 cornerback on this roster right now. Taron Johnson has been deployed across a genuine variety of roles and has impressed in every single one of them. Jacorian Bennett and Decamarion Richardson currently sit ahead of some other names in that cornerback room, and because Jermaine McCoy is still working his way fully back from injury, expect this team to carry extra depth at that position regardless of how the rest of the room shakes out. At safety, Trayvon Morig has looked like a genuine standout throughout this entire process. Jeremy Chin is being deployed creatively across multiple roles within that scheme, and the coaching staff appears genuinely prepared to carry 5 safeties on the final roster, specifically to maximize the positional versatility this defense is building toward. One last thing Kubiak said deserves real serious attention before we close this out, because I think it's the most quietly important comment of his entire press conference. He talked about the roughly 40 days these players now have completely off before training camp officially begins, and he was direct, almost blunt, about the danger sitting inside that stretch of time. He said you can genuinely ruin an entire offseason's worth of progress in 40 days. You put in all that real work through OTAs and minicamp, you build legitimate momentum and chemistry, and then you go sit on a couch for 6 straight weeks, and none of that work carries forward the way it should. And honestly, that's the part of this entire stretch that should make every single fan a little uneasy, because there's genuinely no way to measure it from the outside looking in. You just have to trust that the players on this roster are using this window the right way, staying in shape physically, staying sharp mentally, even while away from the building, keeping that competitive edge fully intact instead of letting it soften and dull. Because the players who walk back into training camp in the best possible shape, both physically and mentally, are the ones who are actually going to make this final roster and make a real, tangible impact once the season actually starts to matter. Kubiak mentioned that a noticeable number of players have already voluntarily chosen to stay at the facility rather than disperse for this break, continuing to put in extra work entirely on their own. And that single detail alone tells you something deeply real about the culture already taking root inside that building. When players choose to stay and grind without anyone forcing them to, that's not coaching rhetoric dressed up for a press conference. That's genuine buy-in. And genuine buy-in, more than any single roster move or quarterback decision anyone makes this summer, is usually the clearest, most honest signal of whether a rebuild is actually heading somewhere real.